"Don't touch it," Elena whispered, her voice barely louder than a breath, but it was already too late. The relic cracked in the Alpha King's hand with a sharp, hollow sound that seemed to echo far beyond the stone walls of Blackwood Citadel, and for a single suspended second, the entire hall forgot how to breathe. A faint glow leaked from the fracture, not bright, not violent, but alive, like something waking after a long, forgotten sleep. Elena felt it before she saw it, a sudden heat blooming beneath her ribs, spreading through her chest, like wildfire racing through dry timber. Her knees hit the cold marble floor, the impact sharp and grounding, yet distant, as if her body no longer quite belonged to her. Around her, the pack murmured, some scoffing, some uneasy, their whispers weaving through the air like wind through dead leaves. "It's just a stone," someone muttered. "Always was." But Elena had never believed that, not in the 10 long years she had spent guarding it, polishing its surface with careful hands, whispering to it in the quiet hours past midnight when the castle slept and the world felt small enough to hold in her palms. She had felt something then, a presence, gentle but vast, like standing at the edge of an ocean you couldn't see but knew was there. And now, that ocean was rising. The Alpha King, Cale Thornridge, stood unmoving, the broken relic still in his grip, his silver-gray eyes narrowed as if trying to make sense of something that refused to be understood. He had shattered it without hesitation, dismissing centuries of warning as nothing more than superstition, his voice cold when he declared it a relic of fear, not power. Elena had tried to stop him. She had taken one step forward, just one, her heart pounding so hard it made her vision blur, but no one listened to an Omega who spoke too softly and stood too small. Now the consequence of that moment rippled outward, invisible but undeniable. The glow intensified, threads of pale light slipping from the fractured stone and curling through the air before sinking into her skin like rain soaking into earth after a drought. Elena gasped, her fingers pressing against the floor as if she could anchor herself to something solid, something familiar, but the warmth inside her only grew, deeper, older, reshaping the rhythm of her breath. The trembling that had always lived in her bones, the quiet, constant reminder of her place, began to fade, replaced by a stillness that felt unfamiliar and impossibly vast. The laughter in the room faltered, then died entirely, replaced by a heavy silence that pressed against every surface. One by one, heads turned toward her, not out of curiosity anymore, but something else, something instinctive. Elena lifted her head slowly, strands of her pale hair falling across her face as she inhaled, steady now, unshaken. For the first time in her life, the air didn't feel too heavy. For the first time, she didn't feel like she had to shrink to fit inside it. When she rose to her feet, it wasn't hurried or uncertain. It was deliberate, controlled. The movement drew every eye in the hall, including the Alpha Kings. Their gazes met, and something unspoken passed between them. Recognition, sharp and immediate. Cale's posture shifted, just slightly, but enough. Enough for those watching to notice. Enough for the balance in the room to tilt. Elena's eyes, once soft and hesitant, now held a quiet, endless depth, like starlight reflected on dark water. She took a single step forward, and the space around her seemed to respond, the very air bending, acknowledging. Then, in a voice no longer fragile, no longer small, she spoke, calm and certain, each word landing with quiet weight. "You didn't break it," she said, her gaze never leaving his. A faint, knowing smile touched her lips, not warm, not cold, something older than both. "You freed me." The silence did not break all at once, it unraveled slowly, like something fragile finally, giving way under pressure no one could see, and every wolf in the great hall felt it, a shift deep in their instincts that had nothing to do with rank or ritual, and everything to do with something far older than either. Elena did not move again after speaking, but she did not need to, because the space around her had already changed, the invisible lines of power that once pressed her down now bending outward, away from her, as if the world itself had reconsidered its understanding of who she was. A low breath escaped someone near the back, then another, uncertain, hesitant, until the room filled with the quiet sound of wolves trying to steady themselves without drawing attention to the fact that they could not. Cale Thornridge remained where he stood, the fractured relic still resting in his palm, but his grip had loosened, just enough for a fine dust of ancient stone to slip through his fingers and fall to the floor like gray snow. His gaze did not leave her, not for a second, and for the first time since he had taken the throne, there was something unfamiliar in his expression, not fear, not doubt, but recognition that he had stepped into something he did not control. Elena felt it too, that connection, not to him as a king, but to the moment itself, to the precise point where everything had tilted and could no longer return to what it had been. The warmth inside her no longer burned. It settled, spreading outward in slow, steady waves that touched the edges of her awareness, filling spaces she had never known were empty. Memories flickered at the edges of her mind, not clear, not yet, but present, like shadows shifting just beyond reach. And with them came a quiet certainty that this was not the beginning of something new, but the return of something that had been waiting, patient and silent, for far longer than anyone in this hall could comprehend. A step sounded to her left, sharp against the marble, and one of the council members, an older wolf with silver threaded through his dark hair, took a cautious half-step forward before stopping, as if an unseen barrier had pressed against him. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, his eyes fixed on Elena as though searching for permission that would not come. She did not look at him. Her attention remained on Kale, steady and unyielding, not challenging, not submissive, simply present in a way that made everything else seem smaller by comparison. The torches along the walls flickered, their flames dipping low before rising again, casting long shadows that stretched toward her feet but did not quite touch her, and the air carried a faint, unfamiliar scent, something clean and distant, like the moment just before a storm breaks over open land. Kale exhaled slowly, the sound controlled, deliberate, but there was tension in the line of his shoulders now, a subtle shift that did not go unnoticed by those who had spent years watching him command every room he entered. He took one step forward, measured, testing, and the hall seemed to hold its breath again, waiting to see if the world would allow it. Elena did not step back. She did not need to. The distance between them felt fixed, not by space, but by something neither of them could yet name. For a brief second, something almost like understanding passed through his eyes, a realization forming piece by piece. And when he finally spoke, his voice was lower than before, stripped of the sharp edge it had carried when he first dismissed the relic as nothing more than superstition. "What are you?" he asked, not as a demand, but as a question he needed answered. Elena tilted her head slightly, considering him, considering the weight behind the words, and for a moment, the faintest echo of the girl she had been lingered in her expression, not gone, not erased, but no longer alone. Then it faded, replaced by something steadier, something that did not rush to respond because it did not need to. When she finally answered, her voice carried that same quiet certainty, calm and unshaken, as if the truth had always been there, waiting for someone to ask the right question. "I am what was hidden," she said softly, her gaze never breaking from his, "and what you chose to set free." The words settled over the hall like a quiet storm, not loud, not forceful, but impossible to ignore, and for a long moment no one moved because no one knew how to respond to something that did not fit within the rules they had lived by their entire lives. Elena could feel their confusion, not as thoughts, but as pressure in the air, subtle shifts that brushed against her awareness like distant echoes, and it no longer overwhelmed her the way it once would have. Instead, it clarified everything. She understood now, not through explanation, but through instinct, that the weakness they had seen in her had never truly existed. It had only been hidden beneath something carefully sealed, something that had waited for the right moment to return. Her gaze drifted, just slightly, taking in the hall she had stood in countless times before, the same walls, the same torches, the same faces, yet nothing looked the same anymore because she was no longer seeing it from below. A faint movement near the edges of the crowd caught her attention as several wolves unconsciously stepped back, creating space around her without realizing they were doing it, their bodies responding to something older than thought, something rooted deep in instinct. It was not fear in the way they understood fear, it was recognition, the same kind that made a forest fall silent before a storm or caused animals to pause when something unseen passed through their territory. Kale remained at the center of it, unmoving except for the slight shift of his stance, as if he were adjusting to ground that no longer felt entirely stable beneath him. He studied her with an intensity that did not waver, as though trying to piece together a truth that had never been meant to be obvious. Elena felt that scrutiny, but it did not weigh on her. It did not push her to shrink or look away. If anything, it steadied her further, anchoring her in this moment where everything was finally clear. The fragments of the relic still lay scattered at his feet, dull and lifeless now, as if whatever they had contained had fully left them behind, and for a brief second her eyes flickered toward them, not with loss, but with quiet understanding. It had never been the stone that mattered. It had only been the cage. A faint memory surfaced then, sharper than the others, not a full image, but a feeling of stillness, of being held in place for so long that time itself had blurred into something endless, and beneath it, a single constant, waiting. Waiting for this exact moment. Her breath came slow and even as that realization settled into place, and with it came something else, something that had been buried just as deeply, a sense of purpose that did not demand attention but existed all the same, steady and unyielding. She took another step forward, the sound of her foot against the marble echoing softly, and this time the reaction was immediate. Several wolves lowered their gaze without thinking, others stilled completely, and even those who tried to hold their ground found themselves unable to meet her eyes for long. It was not something she was doing consciously. It simply was. Kale noticed it too. She saw it in the way his jaw tightened, not in resistance, but in acknowledgement of a shift he could not deny. For a man who had built his rule on certainty, on knowing exactly where every piece belonged, this was something entirely different, something that did not fit into any pattern he had ever encountered. "You guarded it," he said after a moment, his voice measured, quieter than before, as if speaking too loudly might disrupt something fragile. It was not an accusation. It was an attempt to understand. Elena met his gaze again, steady, unhurried, and for a fraction of a second, the memory of the girl who had spent years in quiet duty flickered beneath the surface, not erased, but changed, no longer defined by what others believed her to be. "I was placed there," she replied, her tone calm, carrying no resentment, only truth. Not to protect the stone, but to remain with it. The distinction hung between them, subtle but significant, and Kale's eyes narrowed slightly as the meaning settled in. Remain with it. Not guard. Not serve. Remain. As if she had always belonged there. As if her presence had been part of the seal itself. The realization shifted something in his expression, a deeper understanding forming, and for the first time, the possibility that this had never been about control, but about containment, began to take shape. Elena felt that shift, felt the moment the truth started to take hold, and she did not rush it. She simply stood there, steady and certain, as the world around her slowly adjusted to the reality it had never expected to face. The realization did not arrive as a single thought. It unfolded in layers, each one settling deeper than the last until the entire room seemed to tilt around a truth no one had prepared for, and Elena stood at the center of it, no longer overlooked, no longer dismissed, but impossible to ignore. The torches along the stone walls flickered again, their light bending in subtle, uneven patterns, as though the air itself had begun to shift in response to her presence, and the scent that lingered in the hall grew clearer, something crisp and distant, like winter wind sweeping across open ground before the first snowfall. She did not need to search for it. She recognized it without effort, the same quiet essence she had felt for years while standing beside the relic, the same presence that had once felt separate from her, now woven seamlessly into every breath she took. Across from her, Kale Thornridge remained still, but his stillness had changed, no longer the effortless command of a ruler who controlled every outcome, but the careful restraint of someone navigating something unknown, something that could not be forced or dismissed. His eyes moved briefly to the fragments at his feet, then back to her, and the connection between those 2 points, broken stone and living presence, was no longer something he could deny. Then the relic was never meant to hold power, he said slowly, the words measured, as if testing each one before allowing it to settle into the silence. Elena watched him, her expression steady, the faintest shift of her head acknowledging the truth in what he had begun to understand. "It was never meant to hold power," she replied, her voice calm, carrying the weight of something older than memory. "It was meant to hold me." The words did not echo, but they carried, moving through the hall with a quiet certainty that reached every corner, and the reaction was immediate, not loud, not chaotic, but undeniable. A ripple passed through the gathered wolves, a subtle but collective intake of breath, as though something deep within them had recognized the significance before their minds could fully grasp it. Elena felt that recognition as clearly as if it had been spoken aloud, not as approval or fear, but as awareness, the same instinct that told them when something ancient stood before them, something that did not need to prove itself because it simply was. Another memory surfaced then, stronger than before, not just a feeling but a fragment of understanding, a sense of being placed, not trapped, not imprisoned, but anchored, held within the relic not as punishment, but as necessity, as if the world itself had required her to remain hidden until the moment it could no longer do so. Her gaze shifted briefly toward the high windows that lined the hall, where faint moonlight filtered through, pale and steady, and for an instant, the light seemed to respond, brightening just enough to catch against her eyes before settling again. The movement was small, easily missed, but not by Cale. He saw it, and something in his expression tightened, not in resistance, but in realization that this was not an isolated event, not a single moment of change, but the beginning of something far larger than either of them. He took another step forward, slower this time, deliberate, as if each movement required careful consideration, and the space between them shifted again, not closing, but deepening, charged with a quiet intensity that drew the attention of everyone watching. Elena did not retreat. She remained exactly where she was, grounded in a way she had never known before, her presence steady, unshaken, as if the very foundation beneath her feet had aligned itself to support her. "Why now?" Cale asked, his voice lower, not demanding, but searching, as if the answer mattered in a way he could not yet explain. Elena considered the question, not because she did not know, but because the answer was not simple, not something that could be reduced to a single moment or reason. She felt it instead, the convergence of time, of choices, of a single action that had broken something meant to remain intact until it no longer could. Her eyes returned to his, calm and certain. "Because you chose to break what others only feared," she said softly. "And the world does not hide forever." The words settled between them, not as a warning, not as a threat, but as a truth that could not be undone, and in that moment, the balance that had defined everything within those walls shifted completely, leaving behind something new, something untested, and something that neither of them could turn away from. The air did not settle after her words. It deepened, thick with something unseen yet undeniable, as if the very space within the hall had begun to listen, and Elena stood at its center, not as an intruder, but as something long expected. The faint glow that had once belonged to the relic now lingered subtly around her, not visible as light, but present in the way shadows hesitated at her edges, and the torches along the walls burned steadier when she passed near them. She became aware of every small shift, every breath drawn too sharply, every heartbeat that quickened in the presence of something unfamiliar, and for the first time, none of it overwhelmed her. It aligned. It made sense. Across from her, Cale Thornridge exhaled slowly, his gaze unwavering, but there was no longer any trace of dismissal in his expression, only calculation, not cold, but precise, as if he were beginning to understand that whatever stood before him could not be approached as an enemy or dismissed as an anomaly. It had to be understood. He lowered his hand at last, letting the last fragments of stone fall completely from his palm, and the soft sound they made against the marble floor seemed louder than it should have been, marking the end of something that had lasted far longer than any of them realized. Elena watched the motion without attachment. There was no sense of loss, no instinct to retrieve what had been broken. The purpose of the relic had been fulfilled the moment it shattered. What remained now was not its absence, but her presence. A subtle shift rippled through the gathered wolves as one of the younger alphas, standing near the front, instinctively lowered his head, not in formal respect, but in something more immediate, something he did not seem aware of until it had already happened. Others followed in smaller ways, a step back, averted eyes, a stillness that replaced restless tension. No one spoke. No one dared to interrupt what they did not understand. Elena felt the shift, not as dominance, but as alignment, as if something within them recognized a pattern that had always existed, now finally visible. Her attention returned to Kale, steady, unwavering, and for a brief moment, something unspoken passed between them again, not a challenge, not a submission, but a shared awareness that this moment had bound them in a way neither had chosen. He had been the one to break the seal. She had been the one within it. Cause and consequence, now standing face to face. If you were meant to remain hidden, Kale said quietly, his voice measured but carrying clearly through the hall. Then something changed. It was not a question this time. It was a statement, shaped by the understanding that nothing like this happened without reason. Elena considered him, her expression calm, her gaze steady, and beneath that calm, something deeper stirred, not emotion as she had known it before, but awareness, layered and expansive, stretching beyond this room, beyond this moment. She could feel it now, faint but undeniable, threads extending outward, connecting to something distant, something that had shifted the instant the relic broke. It did, she answered softly. The simplicity of her response did not diminish its weight. If anything, it made it heavier, because it left no room for denial. The world had changed. The moment had come, and none of them yet understood what that truly meant. Kale's eyes narrowed slightly, not in suspicion, but in focus, as if he were tracing those same unseen threads, searching for where they led. He took another step forward, closing the distance by a small but deliberate measure, and this time, Elena felt it differently, not as intrusion, but as acknowledgement, as if he were stepping into something he had already accepted could not be undone. Then whatever was holding you, he said, his voice lower now, almost thoughtful, was not just protecting you from the world. The implication lingered between them, unfinished, but clear. It had been protecting the world from her. The thought did not disturb Elena. It settled into place with quiet certainty, another piece of something larger aligning. She tilted her head slightly, her gaze softening just enough to reflect a deeper truth, one that did not carry threat, but did not hide from it either. Not everything hidden is meant to stay gentle, she said, her voice calm, steady, and impossibly composed. The words were not a warning. They were not a promise. They were simply truth. And as they settled into the silence, the balance within the hall shifted once more, not violently, not suddenly, but with the quiet inevitability of something that had always been coming, now finally stepping into the light. The truth did not settle quietly after her words. It lingered, stretching outward into the unseen spaces beyond the stone walls. And Elena felt it as clearly as she felt the ground beneath her feet, a widening awareness that did not stop at the edges of the hall, but continued, threading into something vast and waiting. It was not overwhelming. It was familiar, like stepping into a memory she had always carried but never fully understood. The faint pull grew stronger, not urgent, but persistent, like a distant current calling her forward, and for a brief moment, her gaze drifted past Kale, beyond the gathered wolves, toward the tall windows where the moonlight rested in quiet silver bands across the floor. The light shifted again, subtle but deliberate, as if acknowledging her attention, and something deep within her responded in kind, a quiet resonance that moved through her chest and settled into a steady rhythm. Across the room, Kale noticed the change immediately. His eyes followed hers, tracking the invisible line of focus. And though he saw nothing out of place, he understood that something had drawn her attention beyond what anyone else could perceive. That alone was enough to sharpen his awareness further. He had built his rule on reading what others missed, on understanding the unspoken before it became a threat. But this was different. This was not something hidden. This was something emerging. He took another step closer, not abruptly, not forcefully, but with intention, closing the distance enough that the tension between them became more defined, more tangible. Elena did not turn away from the window right away. She allowed the pull to settle, to clarify, and when she finally looked back at him, there was something new in her expression, not stronger, not brighter, but deeper, as if another layer of understanding had quietly fallen into place. "You feel it," Kale said, his voice low, controlled, but no longer detached. It was not a guess. It was recognition. Elena held his gaze, steady and unshaken, and for a moment, the space between them felt less like a divide and more like a connection neither of them had chosen, but both now stood within. "It is not just here," she replied softly. The simplicity of her words carried a weight that pressed outward, reaching the edges of the hall and beyond, and a subtle unease rippled through those listening, not because they understood, but because they sensed that whatever had begun in this room did not belong to it alone. A faint sound echoed from somewhere beyond the chamber, not loud enough to be identified, but distinct enough to be noticed, like the distant shifting of something large settling into place. Several wolves turned their heads instinctively, their senses reaching outward, but finding nothing they could name. Elena felt it more clearly. Not a threat. Not yet. But movement. Change. The threads she had sensed earlier were no longer still. They were responding. She took a slow breath, the air filling her lungs with a calm that did not falter, and as she exhaled, that same quiet certainty returned, anchoring her in the center of something far larger than the moment itself. Cale watched her closely, every detail, every shift, every breath, and for the first time, the question forming in his mind was not how to control what was happening, but how to understand it before it moved beyond his reach entirely. Then whatever was hidden, he said carefully, his voice measured but firm, was not meant to remain hidden forever. Elena's expression softened, not in weakness, but in acknowledgement, as if he had finally reached a point she had been waiting for him to see. "No," she said quietly. "It was meant to wait." The distinction was small, but it carried everything. Wait implied purpose, timing, design, not accident, not mistake. And as those implications settled, the weight of what had been set into motion became impossible to ignore. The hall remained silent, but it was no longer the silence of uncertainty. It was the silence of something gathering, something aligning just beyond sight, preparing for what would come next. Elena felt it clearly now, not as a distant pull, but as a quiet certainty that the moment of stillness they stood in would not last much longer. The world had shifted, and it was beginning to answer. The stillness did not hold. It shifted, subtle at first, like the quiet moment before wind moves through trees, and Elena felt it clearly, the thread she had sensed before now tightening, aligning, drawing something closer with each passing second. The faint sound beyond the hall came again, not louder, but nearer, like a presence approaching the edges of awareness without stepping fully into sight. Around her, the wolves grew restless, their instincts reacting before their minds could catch up, shoulders stiffening, breath shortening, eyes flickering toward the doors as if expecting something to appear. Elena did not look toward the entrance. She did not need to. Whatever was coming, she already felt it. It was not foreign. It was not separate. It was connected to the same force now moving quietly within her, a resonance that did not frighten her, but called to something deeper, something that recognized the shift as necessary, as inevitable. Cale noticed the change in the room as well, but his attention did not break from Elena, not even for a second. He had learned long ago that the center of any shift was where the truth revealed itself, and right now, that center stood directly in front of him. The faint tension in his posture sharpened, not defensive, but ready, as if he understood that whatever had been set into motion was no longer contained within the walls of his citadel. "Something is responding," he said, his voice low, carrying just enough to reach her without disturbing the fragile balance in the room. Elena's gaze remained steady, her expression calm, but there was no hesitation in her response. "It has always been there," she said softly. "It is only now that it can answer." The words settled heavily, not because they were unclear, but because they carried a certainty that left no room for doubt. A sudden shift of air moved through the hall, not a gust, not a draft, but a subtle pressure that brushed against every surface and every person, like a breath drawn by something unseen. The torches flickered again, their flames bending in unison before straightening, and the faint silver light from the windows deepened, casting longer shadows across the marble floor. Elena felt the pull strengthen, no longer distant, no longer faint. It was close now, not threatening, not hostile, but undeniable. She took a slow step forward, not toward the doors, not toward the windows, but simply forward, and the reaction was immediate. The space parted before her without command, wolves stepping aside instinctively, their movements quiet, almost reverent, though none of them seemed aware of why they were doing it. Kale did not move aside. He remained where he stood, his presence steady, his gaze locked on hers, and for a brief moment, the world seemed to narrow to the space between them. Cause and consequence. Action and awakening. He had broken the seal. She had risen from it. Now something else was answering. If it comes here, Kale said, his voice quieter now, more focused, will it answer to you? It was not a demand. It was not a command. It was a question shaped by understanding that whatever power had awakened did not belong to him to control. Elena considered him for a moment, her expression unreadable in its calm, and beneath that calm, the deeper awareness continued to expand, threading outward, touching something vast that moved just beyond the reach of sight. It does not answer to anyone, she said softly, but it knows me. The distinction settled between them, subtle but absolute, and Kale's eyes sharpened as the meaning took hold. Not control, not command, recognition, a presence that would not bow, but might listen. The faint sound came. Again, closer now, followed by a low, distant vibration that traveled through the stone beneath their feet, barely noticeable, yet impossible to ignore once felt. Several wolves shifted uneasily, their instincts pressing them toward caution, toward retreat, but none of them moved beyond a step, held in place by something stronger than fear. Elena felt the vibration differently, not as a warning, as confirmation. She lifted her gaze slightly, not looking at anything visible, but sensing the point where the unseen approached the edge of the world she could touch. Her breathing remained even, her posture unchanged, but something within her settled into readiness, not for conflict, but for recognition. Whatever had begun the moment the relic broke had reached beyond this hall, beyond this pack, and now it was returning, drawn by the same force that had awakened her. And as the unseen presence drew closer, the truth became undeniable. She had not simply been freed. She had been found. The moment stretched thin, as if the world itself held its breath, and then it came, not with noise, not with force, but with presence, a quiet arrival that pressed against the edges of the hall without crossing them, like something vast pausing just beyond a threshold it had waited lifetimes to reach. Elena felt it fully now, no longer distant, no longer forming, but here, surrounding, watching in a way that was not seen but deeply known. The faint vibration beneath her feet steadied into a slow, rhythmic pulse, matching the quiet cadence of her own breath, and for a fleeting second, the boundary between her and whatever approached blurred into something shared. Around her, the wolves stiffened, their instincts flaring in silent alarm, shoulders tightening, heads turning toward the great doors that stood closed, yet somehow no longer felt like a barrier. A few took a cautious step back, others froze entirely, caught between the urge to flee and the inability to move at all. Elena did neither. She remained exactly where she was, her posture calm, her presence grounded, as if she had always known this moment would come and had been waiting for it with the same patience that had once kept her beside the relic. Kale stood firm as well, though the shift within him was unmistakable, his awareness sharpened, his focus absolute, every instinct telling him that whatever approached was not something to command, not something to challenge blindly, but something to understand before it chose how to act. The torches dimmed again, not extinguished, but softened, their light lowering just enough for the silver glow from the windows to take prominence, casting long, pale reflections across the floor that seemed to stretch toward Elena, as if drawn by an unseen current. The pressure in the air deepened, not suffocating, but immense, like standing at the edge of something that reached far beyond the limits of sight or comprehension. Elena took a slow breath, and as she exhaled, she allowed the connection to settle fully, no resistance, no hesitation, and in that acceptance, something shifted. The unseen presence responded, not with movement, not with sound, but with recognition. It was not an intrusion. It was not a confrontation. It was an arrival that had always been meant to happen. A faint shimmer touched the edges of the hall, barely visible, like heat rising from sun-warmed ground, and though no shape formed, no figure stepped forward, the sense of something vast and aware became undeniable. Elena's eyes softened slightly, not in weakness, but in acknowledgement, as if greeting something she had known long before this life, long before this body, something that had remained just out of reach until now. Kale saw the change in her expression, subtle but unmistakable, and for the first time, the realization struck him fully, not as theory, not as suspicion, but as truth. This was not the arrival of an external force. This was a return. It came for you, he said quietly, the words steady but carrying a weight he did not attempt to hide. Elena did not look away from the space before her, though her awareness of him remained constant, a quiet anchor within the unfolding moment. No, she answered softly. It came because I am here. The distinction settled with quiet finality, and something in the air shifted again, not heavier, but clearer, as if a question had been answered without needing to be spoken aloud. The faint shimmer expanded slightly, then steadied, and the pressure that had filled the hall eased just enough for breath to return to those who had been holding it without realizing. The wolves did not relax, but they no longer seemed on the verge of retreat. Instead, they watched, uncertain but captivated, drawn into a moment none of them could fully understand. Elena finally took a step forward, slow, deliberate, and as she did, the shimmer responded, not moving toward her, not away, but aligning, as if the distance between them had never truly existed. She stopped, just short of where the unseen presence felt strongest, and for a brief moment, everything stilled again, not tense, not fragile, but complete in a way that made the world feel quieter, more focused, as if everything beyond this single point had faded into the background. Then, with a calm that carried no doubt, no hesitation, she spoke, her voice soft but absolute. You found me. The words did not echo, but they did not need to. The response came not in sound, not in form, but in the undeniable certainty that followed, a silent acknowledgement that moved through the air like a breath released after a long wait. And in that moment, Elena understood what had truly been set into motion. She had not only been freed from the relic. She had stepped back into something that had never truly left her, something that now stood at her side, unseen but present, ready to move with her into whatever came next. The quiet acknowledgement did not fade. It settled, deep and steady, like something ancient finally at rest after a long search, and Elena stood within it, no longer reaching, no longer awakening, but fully present in what she had become. The unseen presence did not withdraw. It remained, not looming, not pressing, but aligned beside her, as natural as breath, as constant as the ground beneath her feet, and for the first time, the space around her felt complete. The hall, once filled with tension and uncertainty, shifted again, not with fear, not with confusion, but with something quieter, something that resembled understanding even if it had not yet found words. The wolves who had stepped back now held their positions, no longer retreating, no longer resisting, but watching with a stillness that spoke of instinct recognizing something beyond hierarchy, beyond rank, beyond the rules they had always known. Elena felt their attention, but it did not weigh on her. It passed over her like wind over open land, noticed, acknowledged, but unable to move her from where she stood. Across from her, Cale Thornridge remained steady, but there was no mistaking the shift that had taken place within him. The certainty that had once defined his presence had been replaced by something more measured, more deliberate, not weakened, but sharpened by the understanding that he now stood before something that could not be ruled in the way he had ruled everything else. His gaze held hers, unwavering, and for a moment, neither of them spoke, because the truth between them no longer required explanation. He had broken what was meant to remain whole. She had become what was meant to remain hidden. And now, neither of them could step back from what that had set into motion. The silver light from the windows brightened slightly, casting a clearer glow across the floor, and as it touched Elena, it did not pass over her as it did the others. It lingered, catching along the edges of her form as if drawn to her presence. She felt it, not as warmth, not as energy, but as recognition, the same quiet acknowledgement she had felt from the unseen force now aligned with her. Everything was connected now, not in fragments, not in pieces, but as a whole that had finally come together. Cale took one final step forward, closing the distance enough that the space between them no longer felt like separation, but like a boundary that had been chosen, not imposed. His voice, when he spoke, was calm, steady, and stripped of any pretense of command. "Then this is not the end of what began here," he said. It was not a question. It was a realization. Elena held his gaze, her expression composed, her presence unwavering, and for the first time since the relic had broken, something within her settled into clarity, not just awareness of what she was, but of what came next. "No," she answered softly. "This is where it begins." The words did not rise, they did not echo, but they carried, moving through the hall with quiet certainty, reaching every corner, every ear, every instinct that had already begun to understand. The unseen presence beside her responded, not with movement, not with sound, but with a subtle shift that felt like agreement, like alignment with a path that had already been set long before this moment. Elena turned slightly then, not away from Kale, but forward, toward the open space of the hall, toward the world beyond the walls that no longer felt like a boundary. The wolves parted again without being asked, creating a path that had not existed moments before, their movements quiet, instinctive, as if guided by something they could not name but could not ignore. She stepped forward, her pace steady, unhurried, each step grounded in certainty, and as she moved, the air seemed to follow, shifting gently in her wake. At the threshold of the great doors, she paused, not out of hesitation, but out of acknowledgement, her gaze lifting slightly, as if sensing the vastness waiting beyond, the same vastness that had answered her call. Behind her, the hall remained silent, but it was no longer the silence of uncertainty. It was the silence of something witnessed, something that would not be forgotten. Elena did not look back. She did not need to. What had been was already behind her. What awaited was already calling. And as she crossed the threshold, stepping into the open night beneath the wide, silver-lit sky, the unseen presence moved with her, not separate, not distant, but one with her path, and the world, vast and quiet and waiting, began to shift in answer.